then she came through and she went to bed right away because she was dealing with
Okay, I believe we are running, if you are.
All right.
I'll watch the info.
Yeah. Are you picking it up?
Yes, I am.
Well, this will be, for this series of talks, this will be the last time that we look at horoscopes. There will be probably only 2 more sessions after this, and in the next session we'll go from isolated patterns to larger and larger complexes, just discussing the ideas behind them, and I'm not going to look up horoscopes for that because I would be forever and a day doing that. And after that, we'll return to where we began at the very beginning, and we'll be looking at spiritual geometry. And only we'll be looking at spiritual geometry in a much better way. Now, next fall, I'm going to offer, for the first time in over 40 years, I'm going to offer an advanced class. And it will be called Astrology, Psychology, and Mysticism. And it will use only 2 horoscopes, maybe 4 if I can get the information that I need. The horoscopes will be the horoscopes of Sigmund Freud and Carl Gustav Jung. If I get the data information, which is very slim chance, I would do Theodor Reich and Marie-Louise von Franz. And the advanced course is going to follow the spiral method of the courses that come before it. That is, it'll go through the material that we did with all of the keywording classes, and it'll do all of the different things that we did in that 10-year course, the more intermediate course, where we looked at all those horoscopes. However, it's not going to be just recapitulation. We're going to do the same things with the horoscopes of Freud and Jung, but what we're going to do is we're going to take all of the things that are involved in those, like, for example, the pre-analysis, where we look at different profiles and put them together. What we're going to do is look at how those same things are done in typologies in Jungian and Freudian psychology. And we're going to look at them in terms of mysticism, what they're pointing to in mystical reality. And then eventually, after we've worked through all of that material, we'll do a house-by-house analysis of the charts. And when we do the house-by-house analysis, there will be new techniques that will be unfolded, and ways for understanding houses will be unfolded. And then we'll look at what each of the houses means in the psychologies of Jung and Freud, as well as in mysticism. The course will be called Astrology, Psychology, and Mysticism. And, for example, like if we look at the 7th house, the 7th house is, in psychology, the transference principle and the countertransference principle. And we'll look at all those kinds of things. All right. This evening we're going to look at case 4 isolated patterns. And the case 4 isolated pattern is when 2 planets are in a trine, and one of those planets also is in a square, and the square is within the bounds of the 2 planets that are in trine. That's our definition of case 4. And once again, it was very difficult to find good examples. And I started looking at it a little bit mathematically, and in terms of probability, any of the 4 cases completely isolated does not happen very often. And if you include things like minor planets or points and parts, forget about it. You won't see the isolated patterns at all. Well, there's too much going on. From this, I conclude, and I think it's right, I think that nature, or destiny working through nature, doesn't want compartmentalization. It doesn't want isolated behaviors, and it wants integration, and it wants unity. So that's the conclusion I come to in all of this. A simple conclusion, but it took quite a bit of work to get to it. Now, I was able to find a few good examples. In fact, some of the examples are very good. And but finding people that people could relate to or understand was difficult. So we'll do what we can. Let's see, where do we have the... Does everybody know who Jeff Skilling is?
Yeah. Enron.
Yeah. He was the CEO of the largest bankruptcy in United States history. He's currently in prison serving out a 15-year term, which he, through a lot of legal manipulation, was reduced from a 25-year term. Oh, let's see, what are we... What we're looking at is the sun is trine to the moon. And within that area, the sun is also, the moon is also square to Saturn. So it's a square inside of a trine, and this is the definition of this is very excellent in terms of isolation. It's a clear isolation. It's an unambiguous case. The trine is between the 6th house and the 10th houses, which are the houses of technique and administration. And they're also the houses of employees and management. So it's a very sunny trine. If you look at it, the fiery sign trine, it's a very expansive, attitude that he has. The sun is the only, in the trine, it's the only aspect that it makes is the trine. So his self-confidence and his self-respect and his self-esteem is very large. He's exceptionally big on himself. At one time when he was applying for graduate school at the Harvard School of Business, the man was interviewing, and part of it was a test, and part of it was your past record, and part of it was an interview. And the interviewer asked him if he thought he was intelligent. His response was, "I'm fucking smart." Yeah. Mercury in Scorpio is not always tactful. It's persuasive, and that's part of the whole business. Mercury conjoined Venus is very, very persuasive.
Do you think that Venus-Jupiter is out of orb?
What?
Venus-Jupiter, is that still in, about to be in a trine?
Yeah, it's a little distant. Venus maybe, but there's plenty of positivity without that. The Jupiter sextiles Pluto, which is Jupiter sextile Pluto, which is clear-cut, and Jupiter trines Uranus. A lot of positivity in all of that. So positivity, when it goes overboard and when it is on self-esteem, is the signature of a con man. And basically, despite all of the MBA and all of that, he's a con man.
The Jupiter is trying the Neptune, not the Uranus.
Yeah, did I say Jupiter trying? Yeah, Jupiter is sextile Pluto, and Jupiter is trine Neptune.
Yeah.
Oh, I said it wrong then. Okay. There's a square between Uranus and Neptune too, but that's not quite as strong, and it's not, well, it is, it comes in there. So, all right.
So what was the con man?
The con man is just that kind of positivity, extreme positivity. He has extreme positivity, and I think that the square of the moon to Saturn shows underneath it all, he's morally selfish, an extremely selfish man. Now, it's interesting because this is the house of employees, and this is the house of other people's money. And a lot of people lost their entire life savings. Most of the employees of Enron took stock options for their pay and their life savings. Instead of having IRAs, they had stock in Enron.
And they took it out of other stuff to put it in there.
Yes, yeah, and when it went down, it's just amazing how clear this is, that it shows the dishonesty with other people's money, especially his own employees. It just shows as clearly as can be. So we can see that the moon square Saturn is a dark kind of consciousness. And you might even say the Uranus square Neptune has dissembling qualities to it. So I don't know what to say about that. If we take it by the degree sequence, the moon leads off. So things start troubled. And then after something going around gets to Saturn, then things clear up and only the trine is effective. And so it's like a happy ending kind of thing. And I suppose he will be happy when he gets out of prison. By degree sequence, it is Sun first, then Moon, but Sun and Moon, since they're so close to each other, are almost simultaneous, and then Saturn. That means by degree sequence, the hammer comes down at the end. I think that the degree sequence is the most influential because that's the way life worked out for him, at least so far, because Saturn rules the 12th house, and right now he's in the 12th house. And so, like, things started out with a great deal of confidence, and everybody, he was the golden boy. Everybody loved him, and everybody was positive about him. But, now he's seen as a dark figure that people hate. Enron was a product of inflated values and prices being jacked up because of sort of having a monopoly. You remember the California energy crisis when there was nothing for energy at all, and they had to buy it all out of Texas. And they basically bought it all from Enron, which was in charge of all of that. George W. Bush, when he was running for president the first time around, was down on Social Security. And all the Republicans are down on Social Security. And as far as I can see, it's meanness, because Social Security costs the taxpayer nothing. Social Security is funded by the people who put money into it. In fact, the government has even borrowed money from Social Security, which we'll never see back in the pension fund, because the U.S. government is doesn't very well stand up. And I can't understand, but at any rate, George W. Bush said, well, if we do away with Social Security, then you can have a private control of what you would normally put in Social Security, and you could invest in things like Enron. He literally said that. And then he denied, when it started coming down for Enron, he denied that he ever knew about anything about Enron, or that he didn't even know Ron Lay, who was the president of Enron, until Doonesbury in the cartoon published a picture of him sitting there in the baseball box, right? Chumsy, palsy, walsy. Doonesbury has taken things like that other people don't touch, and it makes them very public. At one time, Frank Sinatra was trying to deny that he had any connections with the mob at all. And Doonesbury then published a picture of him glad-handing with two mafia chiefs. Crazy, crazy stuff. All right, so we can see this is a clear example. All the rest of the chart is pretty well integrated through the sextiles and trines, but there's this one thing where his superpositivity has a dark side to it, and that's where the square comes in. And the dark side is what Carl Jung would call the shadow. And his shadow side is dishonest with other people's money, and I don't think that he's still fighting legally. All of the many millions of dollars that he made. You know what happened? Enron stock kept going up and up and up, and he sold millions of shares a half a year before things came down, and that's why he was clobbered for inside trading. All right, enough of that. We want to spend our whole evening looking at dark horoscopes. All right, let's see the next one here. We have to deal with another dark character, but by second hand, huh? Yeah. Jerry's reining me in from being too wild and careless about things. Anita Hill. Everybody remembers who Anita Hill was, right? She was the one that was involved in probably one of the greatest he said, she said. Clarence Thomas. Yeah, and at this point, it's very clear that someone has to be lying. Clearly lying. What we're looking at in this case is the moon is the lead planet, and it's the hinge planet. It squares the sun and it squares Uranus. At the same time, it trines Jupiter. So we have a case here of the sun square the moon rather than the sun trine the moon, which we just looked at. The Jupiter trine the moon subtends the whole business, and it shows that there's emotional protection for having to go through what she goes through from the square. The, I don't know how to say it, the Uranus brings in new things in life, unprecedented things in life. And when you find Uranus being active in a horoscope, it's things that surprise you, things that you are not ready and prepared for. In this case, they are jarring to her emotional nature, and they're jarring to her self-image. It just means she has to bring something in. The degree sequence is clearly Uranus is the lowest degree. Then comes Jupiter at 4 degrees, then comes the moon at 6 degrees, and it closes out with the sun. So you can see that things start with suddenly, and there is some good emotional response, but then her self-image in the end is what is in question, is that when we're looking at things by degree sequence. The moon is in the 7th house. Uranus and the sun are in the 10th house. The 7th house is the house of the public, and the 10th house is a house of social prominence. And I have found repeatedly, by looking at many political charts or social charts, as well as in people's lives, when the 7th house and the 10th house are involved, there's usually scandal. And clearly that's what it was. There's no exception here. She was thrust before the public in what was a scandal. Now normally the moon squares would indicate hysteria and temperamentality. And it would indicate that, like she would not only be suddenly shocked, but that there would be an excitability that would be out of her control. Now, the question is, what is this all about? I see nothing in the horoscope that indicates vengeance. The closest thing that comes to vengeance would be Saturn in Scorpio. But Saturn is trine to Mars. It has a square to Pluto, but I don't know how to interpret that. That's just plain dark heaviness. And if this were out of vengeance, or if she did this for money, it certainly would have come out by now, because this was so public, everything about this. I do not also see anything in the horoscope that indicates lying. I think that she can get sexual, how you would say it, emotionally excited, being sensitive and shocked by things, but I do not see anything that indicates that she is a liar. Mercury is clear. Mercury isn't in any of the classical things that would represent lying. So whether she has vengeance or whether she is lying, hard to say. I would say that she's stable enough. With the sun is Neptune is sextile to Pluto. Neptune is trine to Venus, and then you have the moon trine to Jupiter. I would expect that there's enough emotional stability so that she didn't lie just out of being unstable, or that she was some drama queen or something like that. So the basic description to me, it indicates a shock, and it indicates something new, and perhaps it is a shock or something new that means get out of politics. It's not where you belong. The 11th house is the house of friends, and Jupiter being there, says she had plenty of friends that help her to maintain self-composure, and it is a second trine, so it's not like there's any emotional ambitions or anything like that. Now, she seems to have she deported herself in the trial before, in the appearance before Congress. She deported herself extremely well. And since then, her life is like that. The interesting thing about it is that there was a biography of her, and it just ripped her apart, except several years after the biography was published, the biographer recanted and said the whole thing was character assassination, and I was hired. I was hired by the Republicans to do this. Yeah. Now, all right. But Jupiter had the last say, if we look at it by interval, because she's a professor in college, and she has a happy, positive life, and she sleeps the sleep of the just. Clarence Thomas, on the other hand, pulled a race card. He says, this is a lynching. Well, isn't what you did to Anita Hill, is that a lynching also? I'm not a Clarence Thomas fan at all. And Clarence Thomas has not been a good justice on the Supreme Court, because Clarence Thomas was an attorney for Monsanto Chemical. And several cases have come up in which Monsanto Chemical was a party to the case that was being tried before the Supreme Court, and never, ever has Clarence Thomas recused himself, and never, ever has Clarence Thomas voted against Monsanto. So to me, that indicates very poor jurisprudence.
It also indicates it's not isolated, it's a collusion.
Yeah, yeah. Which,
because nobody's calling them on it.
yeah. All right. Grace might be the only person who knows this for her. Right? Bob Fosse. Everybody know who Bob Fosse is? Bob Fosse is a music director, a movie director, and a famous choreographer. He's won Oscars, and he's won all kinds of honors for choreography, and he's won a Grammy. And
For Chicago, he won a bunch of stuff too.
yeah, he won all kinds of things. What we're looking at is the moon is square to Mercury, and the moon is trine to Neptune. It's a pretty good pattern. And this is the way he describes himself. He says, I'm obsessed with that thing in my head until I get it on stage. Meaning to say, he thinks about it, and he thinks about it, and he spins his wheels and spins his wheels until he has the final artistic product, and it's something visual. Perfect, just like the Jeff Skilling, a perfect example of how the pattern works and why it works. And in it all, the moon, this time, the hinge planet is the lead planet and not the trailing planet. Or no, not this. Yeah, this is. We've had a leading planet before. All right. The thing that's in his head is clearly Mercury square the moon. It goes over things again and again and again and again and again, and it's very rapid that it turns things over, and it has hard times. It's a struggle between the emotions and the concrete mentality. The mind wants to do one thing and the emotions want to do another. This is complicated by the fact that Mercury is in Cancer, so the Mercury is under the duress of the mind. So he's a very imaginative individual. There are 3 planets in Cancer, which should itself be imaginative. The moon is involved with Mercury, but especially with Neptune, which is one of the most imaginative combinations that you can get. How to say it? The degree sequence is the moon leads here, but almost instantaneously the trine to Neptune is there, so that he gets an image, but then he starts fluttering over it. There's an interesting situation here in that there is a trine between Saturn, Jupiter, and Uranus, which shows something a little bit more in control. He's famous for his pessimism. In the whole industry, he's famous in that he says it isn't going to work, and it isn't going to work, and it isn't going to work until it does work. I think what this is, he's famous for jazz improvisation in dance, and the improvisation is clearly Jupiter and Uranus. I'm a great lover of jazz improvisation, and I have Jupiter square Uranus. But the Saturn shows that it's under control, and the way that it's under control is the way the case 4 pattern works. Because he's famous in his choreography, not only in saying how the steps should go or the movements should go, but there's enough free form in it for improvisation. But to ensure that the free form is controlled, the Mercury square the moon comes in. And he gives all of his dancers a verbal subtext. And they work on the verbal subtext at the same time that they are dancing. And the square is actually, in this case, structural to accomplishing the image that he wanted to accomplish in the first place. Really, very, very beautiful. I was really pleased this time with finding perfect aspects. Mars and Venus are conjoined in the 7th house. And the 7th house is fine arts. This is a really good example to demonstrate that. And as a fine artist, I have found over the years that the artists that make it successfully have combinations, even afflictions, between Mars and Venus. If it's all Mars, you have an engineer. It's all craft, and the engineers wear white socks, and we know that sort of a thing. If it's all Venus, if it's all Venus, it's all sweet and pleasant and fairy-like, but it has no cojones to it. And when you have the combination of Mars and Venus, you have those qualities, and that's what makes art art. It has something strong and something vital to it. All right. Oh, this is the horoscope that surprised me. All right. Everybody know who Kathy Lee Gifford is?
Yeah.
She's a very multi-talented person. A singer, a dancer, an actress, a celebrity. I don't know what you'd call her on TV. You'd call her a reporter. At first, I thought, well, I'm going to have a real hard time with this because I've never seen her on TV. I don't have a TV, so I never looked. In this horoscope, the case 4 pattern is a side game. It is the moon is square to the Mars. The moon is also trine to Venus. Everything else in the horoscope is just about integrated with everything else. Jupiter interacts with Pluto and the Sun, and Jupiter interacts with Neptune and Saturn, and Neptune and Saturn interact with the Sun and Pluto, and then the Sun and Pluto and Saturn and Neptune also interact with Uranus. So there's a lot of close integration in the chart. That it's almost like you have the pattern and nothing else. The side game and the main pattern or the main complex of aspects. The things start off with the Venus. Venus starts things off, and then, if we're looking by intervals, things start with Venus, and then they come to Mars. Things start out with the trine, and then the square kicks in. And this is the first time we have the square terminal rather than initial. And so that's the way things start out there. By degree sequence, Mars is at the lowest degree, and then comes the moon, and then comes Venus. It seems to indicate that the Mars starting things off by degree sequence is sort of like she's bold. She's an emotional instigator, and things end up with Venus, and she ends up as a loving, kind, sensitive woman. The moon and Venus in trine is probably extremely feminine in water signs. I don't know what to say more about that. This is the first example where the hinge planet is terminal, so that the final outcome is what is important. It's one of those cases that Mark is going to ask that question again this week, and I don't have an answer for it. None whatsoever. And that is, how could this person be so famous with all of the planets beneath the horizon and Uranus not being especially indicating fame? If it does indicate fame, it would more likely indicate infamy than it would fame because Uranus is involved only in squares. I don't have an answer. I can say that I know for certain that the personal affairs in her life are more important than career, and that she will be a failure to herself, or she won't be comfortable or in harmony with herself if she does too much seeking outwardly in a career. She's an interesting person. Her paternal grandfather was a Russian Jew. And her paternal grandmother was partially Native American. And the grandparents on the mother's side were all English and Irish. But she was raised in a conventional Orthodox Judaism. But at age 12, she became a born-again. And she has maintained throughout her life a born-again Christianity. She went to Oral Roberts University on a scholarship, and she's close friends with Anita Bryant, who is the celebrity of the religious right. But despite all of that, she has this. I was pleasantly surprised by what she's done with her life. For example, 2 episodes show really clearly. She started a clothing line. The Mars square the moon, she became industrious. And then there was a large scandal because the clothes that she made with her label on it were made in Central America, and nobody was allowed in the plant. But somebody smuggled out a piece of cloth with the label on it, and it shows that, and when they investigated the place, she was running a sweatshop. And she said, I didn't know anything about it. But publicly, even on television, when it was found out that this was the case and she investigated, she apologized. And she became an advocate for women workers. So what started out as a public rift, she learned her lesson, and she became a positive person. The other thing is that she married a professional football player, Frank Gifford, who was quite famous, and he got the roving eye, and she just stuck with it. And she said, love will win out. And it did. And I have to say that the trine, that the feminine loving qualities deal with and overcome anything that comes from the rash activity that comes from the Mars and the square part of the combination. It brought up a lot of unpleasant things, but she dealt with them. The only way I can see fame in this horoscope is if the planets in the 4th house reflect into the 10th house, but I can't say that because I don't have experience with that at all. I do think that she has a very subjective point of view, and I think that, I don't think she's really active right now on television, and I think in order for her to be active, I think she'd have to leave her subjective viewpoint of things.
No, she's very active in morning television.
Well, she still is, yeah.
Okay. She really comes off as a real ditz.
No kidding. So the Mars moon still comes out then.
Unbelievably goofy.
Yeah, she's 63 years old.
But that's from a man's point of view.
What I was going to ask is, in a horoscope like that, I mean, could that whole thing not be,
Correct? The data not correct?
no, basically a facade or a cover for some of the things that she's done? I mean, you really don't know where she's at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She does play that personality. It may
A
not
charade
be.
is what the word I was looking for.
All right. Do you know, in my life, I've never played charades. In general, I've liked all of the people that are in that we're covering this evening.
Talk about love.
Some people I have a hard time with. This is another case for. This is another side game case for, because everything else in the horoscope is integrated. This one almost isn't a case for. What we're looking at is the moon is square the sun. At the same time, moon is trine Venus. This means trine Saturn. This means that Saturn is the lead planet, because something going around the zodiac will come to Saturn first, and then the sun, and then the moon. So the moon is the terminal planet. By degree sequence, we have probably the closest all night of simultaneity, because the sun and the moon are only 13 degrees apart. So like when something gets to the 17th degree, that square is kicked off right away. And by degree sequence, the Saturn is so weak that it's almost difficult to tell whether the Saturn is even part of the pattern. So.
You didn't mean 13 degrees, you mean 13 minutes, right?
13 minutes, yes. Sorry. The degree sequence for everything else is Neptune at 29, and then comes Mars at 1, and then comes Jupiter at 2, then comes Venus at 2, then comes Pluto at 6, and then Uranus at 7. That means that there's 8 degrees. That means every time the moon goes through the first 8 degrees, or the last of the sign before, in the first 8 degrees, everything's going to be triggered off all at one time, within one day. It's not scattered. The other pattern gets the immediate hit, and then a little while later, it's triggered off. So this is mathematically, it's an interesting chart. By the interval, we said that Saturn leads, and so things begin positively with the trine. Things begin with emotional surety, and then things are mixed when something gets to the sun, and then in this whole area here, everything is mixed until finally it gets to where the moon is. Now, since the square is strong and the trine is only moderate, I'm not sure that this is a clear case of a case for, because of the disparity in strength. It seems to be just a square with auxiliary activity, if there is such a thing. The point is that the pattern we haven't talked about this at all. A pattern is only a pattern if there is something that's ground in. We're saying that isolated patterns represent parts of the character that are isolated from everything else, that have a life of their own. Now, because there's a geometric pattern in the heavens doesn't necessarily mean that a person is going to have that in their consciousness. It doesn't mean that they're going to have some kind of little entity in their aura or something like that is made of the complicated thoughts and feelings that come about from the astrological pattern, that's symbolized by astrological pattern. So I don't know. This was a lot of questioning for me.
So what constitutes grounding?
What?
What constitutes grounding?
Observation can
if
only
there's-
tell.
Or if there's a duplicate?
No, you can see if it's reinforced in ways, yes, but really the only way you can tell is by observation. Some people just, like Bob Fosse, it was clear there that there is something that's set aside because it's ground in and the whole world knows about it. I don't know this with Arthur Ashe.
New version of grind.
Okay. I think that there are a lot of squares in this horoscope. Uranus and Venus are square. Mars and Jupiter and Mars and Pluto are square. Let's see. I think Neptune and Uranus. Oh no, it's Libra. Mercury and Neptune are close to square, but there's too wide there. And then within the pattern we have a square. And the square in this case seems to indicate, how would you say it? Struggle, combat. In fact, his whole life and everything he's ever written and everything he's spoken about, he talks about combat. He talks about racial combat. He has a famous book about how hard it is for black athletes to make it into society and to be accepted. And his whole everything is about struggle. And so central to that is this square of sun and moon, which is probably the strongest aspect in the entire horoscope, and so there is a struggle. And I don't think that the trine is enough to offset that, so his consciousness was basically the consciousness of struggle. And the moon and sun, the sun is in Cancer, which is vacillatory. Libra is vacillatory. The Libra ascendant is vacillatory, and I wonder whether the struggle and the back and forth, whether that is responsible for volleys, like in a tennis game. The volleys, we saw something very similar to this a few years ago when we looked at Steffi Graf. We saw that there was a lot of back and forth in the consciousness. And I don't know whether that's coincidence or whether it's meaningful. The resolution of conflict for him would come through either religion or philosophy. But I don't know about his religious background, and I couldn't find anything on the net about his religious, or whether he espoused any philosophy or something like that. But there are a couple of things that are interesting to me in this. He died of AIDS, but he was not a homosexual. And when we're dealing with AIDS, the letters AIDS mean acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, meaning to say that your body acquires from outside the inability to take care of itself. This is different from autoimmunity. In autoimmunity, your body refuses, the immune system of your body refuses to defend the body, and instead it attacks it. And obviously, when you have something immunodeficient, there is some kind of self-hatred. Because if there's self-hatred, you don't like yourself to the point that you beat up on yourself, and it's right in your physically, in your nature. If we take that and then we look at acquired immunodeficiency, it is a matter of taking on societal hatred.
Boundaries?
What?
And boundaries?
No, and responding to it. Because during most of my life, as I was growing up until in my 40s, the people in society who were hated the most were drug takers and homosexuals. All of that's vastly changed, and those are the people who became subject to AIDS. On top of that, African Americans ran a third to homosexuals and drug users, and they have a much higher incidence of AIDS also. Now it's interesting here that Jupiter conjoined Pluto is a signature of prejudice. It gives him a unique outlook on life, with the Uranus being sextile, And with the Neptune being sextile, he has a unique outlook on life, but basically he fights it. And I'm wondering if his fighting didn't make him subject to getting the AIDS, like sort of like fighting against it all, rather than taking a measured or a loving stance or something like that. I just wonder whether he didn't make himself likely to the disease because of that. And then another thing comes up that's really interesting on top of it all, and that is Venus is square to Uranus, and in a male's charts, that's one of the signatures of homosexuality. So maybe he was a latent homosexual and got the disease not by homosexual means. And when things like that happen, it blows your mind. It makes you really want to have clairvoyance, because if you have clairvoyance, you could read into his aura and see. As it is right now, I have a feel for the chart, and I have a feel for his willingness to struggle and how it would set him up for hate, but I don't have any definite answers. Astrology makes it a little bit easier, but you don't have all the answers.
The Venus square Uranus, wouldn't that also be a love of unusual?
Could be. Yeah, I don't say that it's totally homosexuality. In fact, it isn't always homosexuality. It can mean highly romantic. But I don't know that he has a high romanticism quotient in his character. I hope you don't mind the fact that I don't have answers to a lot of things.
No, it helps us think.
This, in fact, is not really a true case 4. What we're looking at is Mars conjoined Venus is square the moon, and Uranus is trine the moon. So the leading planet, the terminal planet is by the intervals is the moon, and it is also the hinge planet. The reason why this is not a true case 4 is because outside of the orbs of these planets, Uranus does form a trine to Neptune. And so the trine to Neptune indirectly affects the Mars, Venus, and Moon, but the orbs are going the wrong way. This is a very, very difficult chart to work with, and the only reason I put it in is because I find the person fascinating. The Uranus trine the moon clearly is a intuitive nature. But if we look at the chart, there is Uranus in Taurus, Taurus rising, Neptune in Taurus, Pluto in Taurus. We have Uranus in Virgo, we have the Mercury in Virgo, we have the Sun in Virgo, so we have 6 planets and the ascendant in Earth. And that describes him to a T. The Earth signs are the signs that are most likely to be skeptical. And he certainly is skeptical about everything. He was skeptical about religion. He was skeptical about politics. He was even skeptical about a philosophical system based on democracy. He thought that democracy was the tyranny of not so great people on great people. On the other hand,
Do you believe in the masses?
yeah, I understand that, and I go along with it, because we have a lot of people who don't know that are choosing our country. With we'll look at the people that I admit that Obama is a very intelligent man, and that Bill Clinton was a very intelligent man. But you can't say the same for George Bush. I don't mean politically. Or you can't say the same thing for George Bush. I think he may even have a subpar IQ. And so it's very, very difficult to say. And these are the people that we're choosing to lead us. On the other hand, he wasn't in favor of aristocracy either, though aristocracy, I think, was better than democracy, because at least in the aristocracy, the people had education and there was a breed stock there so that there could breed bodies that intelligence could work through. If anything, Mencken was in favor of meritocracy. This is what this horoscope is like. It's a horoscope of a lot of scattered views, a lot of scattered opinions. Is very intuitive, but they're disparate intuitions. There isn't anything unified. And if you read about the man and you read about his life and you read quotes from him, there are some lovely sites for quotes of things that he said. That's what it's like. It's sort of like you reach into a dying fire and you grab a bunch of embers and you throw them up in the air, and it's lit up here and it's lit up there and it's lit up there, but there may not be a lot of relationship between the two of them. The horoscope is not what you would call integrated, it's not coherent, and it's not highly patterned. So the man was very intelligent. I think he maybe took 1 or 2 college courses, and I'm not even sure he graduated from high school. But yet, he wrote a 4-volume work on the English language that is respected to this day by academics. He's really, really sharp, very intelligent. He is self-educated. Did it all on his own. The thing that we're interested in is he was at war with women. He was not high on women. He was definitely not a feminist. And then he got married. It was such a thing that he fell in love when he was married, and it was the moon trine Uranus. And everybody started chiding him, and they chided him publicly, "If you're so down on women, why did you get married?" And he said, "Sometimes good things happen with women." But unfortunately, the marriage lasted only 4 years. And it lasted only 4 years because Venus is in the 6th house, and she was frail and ill, and the moon is in the 8th house, and she died. And so he had a loving relationship with a wife who did soften him, who did trigger a lot of his intuition so that a lot of the trine things came forward. But it only lasted so long. It's interesting, the 1st house surroundings, you have Pluto in the 1st house, and the 4th house is ruled by Leo. Except for the 4 years that he was married, every other day of his life he lived in the same house. That's really something quite interesting.
Well, that was probably more common back then.
Yeah. So it looks like he was a victim of his own character and such. All right. It really, if you look at the chart, you don't get a feeling that it's an altogether kind of person. All right.
What else did he do?
He was a newspaper commentator. He was a public speaker. He wrote for various different publications. He was very much in demand because he would. Excellent writer, very excellent writer. All right, this is the last one we have for tonight, and a favorite of mine. This is Proclus. This is probably one of the oldest horoscopes that you'll ever work with, and it is likely to be quite accurate. It was cast by his disciple Marinus, And Proclus was a Neoplatonist. And the Neoplatonists were all pretty good astrologers. And basically, this is, the whole horoscope is a case 4 pattern and 2 stray outside planets. Mars, which is unaspected, is stray, and Mercury in Aquarius is unaspected. Everything else is in these planets in Aquarius, square to the planets in Taurus in the 2nd house, and trine to the moon in the 3rd house. Now, in Greek mythology, Orpheus was the most famous musician. Linus was the most skilled musician, but Orpheus was the most famous. He was reputed to have moved stones with his music, and even trees, which is symbolic. It's metaphorical. And he is reputed to have tamed wild animals with his music. He's famed for his singing and playing music. He's famed for singing his way into Tartarus. He lost his fiancée when she was on the way to the wedding. I think somebody tried to rape her, and then she was bit in the ankle by a serpent, and she died. And so he went into the underworld, which was called Tartarus, and the king of the underworld was called Hades. And he sang to Hades, and Hades liked it, and Hades said he could have his wife back if he didn't look at her until they were both in the sunlight. And what happened is he sang, Rainer Maria Rilke has a lovely poem about it, about them coming out of the shadow from the underworld, and Mercury leading, and Orpheus singing, and being followed then by Eurydice. And what happened was they got out into full sunlight, and he turned and he peaked too soon because one ankle was still in the shade, and then she fell back into the underworld and remained there. He retreated from much active life, and he became a priest of the cult of Apollo, especially the Apollo Smintheus, where we get our name Smith from. And he sang and prophesied. And as a priest of Apollo, he was a vegetarian, and he drank only water. And Bacchus came by, and Bacchus was the wine god, and he had these bacchantes who followed him, and they just had orgiastic celebrations, being drunk on wine, and they tried to tempt Orpheus into drinking, and he wouldn't drink. And they were drunk and revelrous, and they pulled him apart limb for limb while he was alive. And the head they threw into a stream. And the head didn't stop singing. It kept singing wisdom and prophecy as it floated down to the ocean, where it was taken and put into an underground grotto, and it continued to sing prophecy and wisdom until Christ, until the day of Christ. And then it stopped. All of the oracles stopped at the same time, and the Neoplatonists, who were not Christians, agree that the reason was the same, but that's way aside. Nonetheless, the way it is all of the Orphic followers, the followers of Orpheus, were all mathematicians. And they were all prolific in speaking and singing and writing. Hesiod wrote voluminous poetry. Pythagoras studied the harmonics of music as well as being a mathematician and an Orphic philosopher. Plato was extremely prolific. It takes volumes to cover all of his material. Plotinus was extremely prolific. But of all of the Neoplatonists, this is the most prolific. Mind you, he wrote 700 lines a day. 700 lines a day, which is almost unbelievable. And at the same time, he gave as many as 5 lectures in a day. So this is really. So what we're looking at is the outlet of this gigantic case 4 is the moon, and the moon is in Gemini, and it's in the 3rd house. So that speaking and writing and things like that would be extremely prolific. There is the pressure that comes from the struggle with the square that finds its outlet in speaking and writing. Now the pattern functions on 2 levels. He was a wealthy man. His father was a famous lawyer in Constantinople and in the Holy Roman Empire, was a very influential person and was very wealthy. However, he tried to become a lawyer, but in a couple of cases he just realized, hey, I don't like the law as much as I like philosophy. And so he went to Alexandria and learned Neoplatonism there, but he thought the best place to learn it was in Athens, and he eventually held the chair of Plato in the academy in Athens. So he was struggling to live the life, a simple life of a vegetarian and a very pure liver, while at the same time having to deal with wealth and power and all the illusions of wealth and power. And it was a constant struggle in his life.
Okay, so the moon is trine Uranus,
Yep.
right? And,
Yep.
and what's the
His
square?
moon is these planets by association
Okay.
are in there. So
And the square?
yes, in the square and the trine. By association, it carries through. The whole pattern is touched off. When you have this is like when we looked at Temujin last time. Temujin had the whole pattern. It wasn't neatly defined by close orbs, but because everything was all piled together, it was in effect a single pattern, and that's what we have with this. So he was fairly successful in struggling with wealth and power and politics and things like that. He was successful in getting away from it. And he was successful in getting away from it by dedicating himself to writing and teaching and things like that. The other, let's see, the other struggle was the struggle of idealism versus materialism. A materialist believes that everything is, even our consciousness, is a product of interactions of matter. A philosophical idealist is someone that believes that everything is a precipitate of a higher spiritual state. Some idealists are only mental. The thought is behind everything. But a true spiritual idealist is someone that thinks it all comes from spirit. So he had to struggle with most of the philosophies at his time, which were materialistic. Especially this was the very strong influence of Aristotle. Aristotle was the philosopher of the earth. If you see him on that picture up there, he's arguing with Plato, and Aristotle is pointing to the ground, whereas Plato is pointing to heaven. And so this was a constant struggle. And again, he took the idealistic point of view. He did incorporate, a lot of the later Neoplatonists did incorporate some of Aristotle because it was undeniable. They incorporated some of Aristotle into Neoplatonism, but he was basically stayed true to the idealism. Now, most of the works of this man, I have volumes. Here he wrote 2 thick volumes on the Timaeus of Plato, and there are volumes of writings of him, but it's not most of his material. Most of the material is lost. It's been lost forever. He has the thing that I would most like to read, and that's a Neoplatonistic interpretation of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which I'd like to take a fling at that myself, which would be fun. But he remained true. Interesting thing, this is just a sideline, it has nothing to do with the chart. This was the time of the Holy Roman Empire. It's the time that he was having to fight with the dogmatism of Christianity. And eventually the Neoplatonists were very much disliked by the Holy Roman Empire. So he was put into exile. And when he was in exile, he still thrived. He went around the entire empire and got himself initiated into all of the various different cults and was able to synthesize that into his work. And that's all I have for tonight. It was a fun, fun time doing all of this. And Mark must have at least one hard question.